Well, I'm here with Kathleen Parrish. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's get started by having you tell us a bit about your own personal story and the journey you took to becoming involved in the world of recovery.
Great. So,
Wait, I'm going to move this real quick.
So I became interested in the field of counseling a long time ago. I graduated with my master's in 1999, and I became a licensed professional counselor in 2002. So, actually 2001. I'm getting old, forgetting the dates. I got really excited when I found treatment and understood sort of what happened there. I really like the work of treating co-occurring disorders, not just substance use. Actually, my background and training and expertise is in treating trauma and PTSD. I get really excited about watching people move through recovery and beginning to embrace a new version of who they are in recovery and really learning to understand what they've survived and where their strengths lie. And so, over time that's just sort of evolved into something that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah. And so like you said, you have a long history working with trauma. What drew you to work with trauma survivors specifically?
Well, I think we all have a little trauma in our lives, right? And I'm always touched by that willingness of people to be real and to be vulnerable and to connect. And those are pieces that fit really well for me in terms of how I continue my journey through life and recovery. And so, as I've grown and learned just sort of who I am, I think connecting with people in that way has been really powerful for me. And so I'm really grateful to show up for other people that same way.
Yeah. And so were you a survivor of trauma yourself, or did you have some personal experience with that in your family or something?
Coming from a divorced home, when I was a child, I think there's some elements there that were traumatic, and just figuring out how you move forward in life and how you understand your family system. And so I think for me, it's inspired a willingness to be really compassionate for people who are suffering.
Yeah. And so now you're serving as Director of Clinical Services at Cottonwood, Tucson. I guess what led you to that particular opportunity?
Well, I've been at Cottonwood for almost 17 years, a long time. When I stepped on the campus, I fell in love. It's a fabulous facility, and
that's in Arizona.
It's in Tucson, Arizona, and it's cooling off there right now, so it's a good thing. It does get really hot there in the desert in the summer. But I love Cottonwood's very unique. It's a truly individualized treatment program. Everyone touts individual treatment. It is probably one of the best examples of individualized treatment that I've ever seen. It's a really caring, nurturing facility. It's a really safe place for people to recover. It's very spiritual. We're out in the desert with the cactus and the coyotes and the javelinas.
Openness.
If you know what a javelina is.
It's like a pig?
It's part of the rodent family, actually. Okay. Yeah, but it looks like a giant pig. It looks like a wild boar. They have tusks and they smell bad, but they're pretty fabulous to see them from a distance.
Wow.
So one of my favorite memories was that we had a mama bobcat with her babies, and the babies were in the trees with their paws kind of swinging, in the air. They were kind of lounging around. So it's a really neat place to be. So people heal there. People tend to stay a very long time with us in their journey. So it's pretty great. We have a great team of specialists who are really caring and compassionate.
Yeah, and so do you kind of feel like there's a spiritual connection with the desert and the openness and all that?
Yeah, it's really great.
Cool, yeah. And so at the conference, you're giving a presentation on grief and loss, titled Embracing the Abyss. And grief and loss are such universal themes, but I'm guessing it affects each individual differently, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so what are some common responses you see?
So one of the things I was talking about as I was sharing with the group is that grief is really part of the human condition. We are all, one of us, at any given time, either one of us are going to experience a grief. And so understanding that piece, because it's part of our human condition, it also means that we have the capacity to recover from it. That we're equipped to deal with grief. It's part of our experience in life. And so understanding that helps us with the building blocks of how we recover. More specifically, I talked a lot about traumatic grief. And so I think that more and more we're seeing people who are affected by trauma who have a grief kind of hardwired into that. So we're looking at some of the events over the last several years, the mass shootings, terrorist attacks, those kind of things where people have suffered quite traumatically, and that there's a grief intertwined with that and the loss of someone they loved, or in losses that are implied in some of those events.
Yeah, and kind of a loss of innocence almost.
Right. Loss of innocence, loss of safety, loss of trust, loss of what we perceive to be our reality versus what it really is. And the loss of so many things really wrapped up in those events.
Yeah. And so how do you describe kind of the difference between grief and then this traumatic grief?
So I think any grief, we can experience grief around so many things. So we can be grieving the loss of a job that we loved, right? Or the loss of a relationship, a breakup or something like that. We can experience the loss of a pet that was really beloved to us. I've been through that loss. I don't know if you're a pet person, but
I'm allergic, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, I've lost dogs that have been, they leave a terrible void. So we can have grief around any number of things. We think of grief typically when we lose someone that we love, and that's truly the case, that we experience a very specific, painful time of grieving when we lose a loved one. Traumatic grief is that loss we weren't expecting. It's the kind of loss that comes from a suicide, that comes from violent death, that comes from an injury, an accident, something we weren't anticipating. A lot of people experience traumatic grief when they lose a child.
Right.
It's a loss you were not anticipating. Children aren't supposed to die before their parents.
Right, yeah.
And so that kind of loss is very traumatic for people. And what happens is that when they have that loss, it's encoded in their brain in terms of all the level of experiences that they had at that time. Sights, sounds, smells, last memories, significant feelings of guilt or self-blame that you see wrapped up in that kind of loss.
Yeah, and you say that's kind of like hardwired, coded in.
Hardwired, it's encoded in the brain. So people don't grieve that in the natural way that we would tend to grieve an expected or anticipated loss. Okay. Now, if we have a parent that's aging and we know, my parents are starting to age and my mom's been ill, and you kind of anticipate at some point that they will move in that direction. It's when it's unexpected and you didn't anticipate that was going to happen. Someone dies in a car crash, or, as I said, in some of the more traumatic events we've seen, we just hit the 1-year anniversary of the Las Vegas shooting, and you think about the level of people that were impacted by that, and such a fearful thing. So as a result, some of the losses for us is we can't enjoy being outdoors in a large concert because, what do you think about? And you think about the risks. For those who are directly impacted or know someone that was directly impacted, there was traumatic grief really involved in that whole event.
Yeah, and so I guess what are some other of the key aspects of traumatic grief, complex grief that you see in your work?
So what I see is that people don't move on. They don't really recover. Their life stopped when they lost their loved one in that way. They have a lot of guilt, a lot of I should have, I could have. It's sort of like the before and after. Before this loss, here's who I was, and then after this loss, I don't know who I am now. I'm really lost. And people tend to stay in that space of traumatic grief or complicated grief for many, many years without resolution, versus traditional sort of grieving. If you're looking diagnostically, they say that grief symptoms usually resolve within 6 months to a year. I don't know how true that is. I think some people may have grief for a long period of time, but traumatic grief is very different and complicated. Usually what you see is that you see people having not just symptoms of complex grief, but also of post-traumatic stress disorder.
And it can last longer?
Oh yeah, that can last for a lifetime. I've worked with people who lost someone traumatically years ago, and they still had ongoing symptoms that were disturbing and interrupting their ability to function.
Yeah, and that's just part of the normal journey. So it's not like they should be getting somewhere faster, right?
Right. Well, I mean, everybody's grief is different. There's really no beginning and end